Fort Caldwell, Texas, the last week of August. The heat comes off the training fields in waves by 6 in the morning, shimmering up from the asphalt and the packed earth and the metal rooftops of the equipment buildings like the ground itself is breathing. By 7:30, when the registration tables opened for the 11th Annual Joint Forces Combat Showcase, the temperature had already crossed 92 degrees. Nobody commented on it. This was Texas. This was August. You either adapted or you didn't belong there in the first place. 500 soldiers, sailors, Marines, and special operations personnel moved through the main administration area in organized streams, clipboards changing hands, bracket assignments, being called out voices, overlapping in the specific kind of controlled noise that belongs to places where discipline is the first language and everything else is translation. It was the kind of morning that had happened 10 times before in this exact location and would happen again. The kind of morning that looked ordinary from the outside and felt like electricity from the inside because every person in that tent knew what the next 2 days could mean. The Joint Forces Combat Showcase had built careers. It had ended them. It had produced officers whose names were now on buildings and instructors whose reputations traveled faster than they did. For 11 years, the showcase had also produced one consistent truth about the hand-to-hand combat bracket. His name was Cole Harrington. He was 35 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, 230 pounds of muscle built over 15 years of military service shaped by thousands of hours in training rooms and competition rings, and 2 combat deployments that had refined him the way fire refines metal by burning away everything that wasn't essential. 3 consecutive years as top finisher in the combat bracket, 2 formal commendations from his commanding officer, a reputation so dense it practically entered rooms ahead of him. He walked through Fort Caldwell the way a man walks when he has never lost on familiar ground, not arrogant exactly, but certain. The certainty of a person who has stood at the center of a thing so many times that the center has started to feel like it belongs to him. That morning, Harrington stood near the registration table with a cup of coffee in one hand and a bracket assignment sheet in the other. Corporal Jake Whitfield stood nearby, as he usually did, close enough to be useful and far enough to be invisible. 2 junior soldiers completed the circle, the kind of young men who had learned that proximity to Harrington was an investment with unpredictable returns. Harrington ran his eyes down the bracket sheet with the unhurried attention of a man who already knows what he's going to find. His expression held the particular ease of the expected. He moved through the names the way a person moves through a familiar room in the dark by memory and feel touching nothing he doesn't recognize. And then he stopped. Not visibly. His body didn't tense. His shoulders didn't shift. Nothing about his posture announced that anything had changed, but something changed anyway in the quality of his attention, in the way his eyes dropped slightly and then rose again to the name printed cleanly on the bracket sheet. Reeves, M. He read it once. Then he set his coffee cup down on the registration table. He placed his thumb over the name, not to cover it, just resting there, the pad of his thumb against the paper, like he was checking whether it was real. Then he picked up the coffee, turned, and walked away without saying a word. Corporal Jake Whitfield watched him go. In 2 years alongside Harrington, he had developed a refined instinct for the man's moods, the way a ship's crew learns to read weather. What he saw in the next few seconds, Harrington's pace 2 beats too quick, the slight forward angle of his shoulders, told Whitfield something he didn't have a name for yet. Something that sat lower than anger and colder than irritation. He filed it away and followed. 3 rows behind the registration line, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun stood at a secondary table and finished filling out her form. She wore a plain gray training shirt and standard issue shorts. She had arrived at 7:45, stood in line without speaking to anyone around her, and when someone in front of her started a loud conversation with a friend, she moved slightly to the left to give them room and kept writing. Her name was Maya Reeves. She was 24 years old, and she had driven herself to the base from the off-post housing unit where she'd been staying, arriving with a duffel bag, a water bottle, and a printed copy of the registration confirmation she'd received 3 weeks ago from Sergeant First Class Sandra Voss. Voss had submitted Maya's name to the tournament committee without telling her first. She had called afterward to explain. "You've earned the right to be in that bracket," Voss had said. Maya had been quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "The right isn't the part I'm thinking about," she had said. "What part are you thinking about, whether being there helps anyone who matters?" Voss had thought about that for several seconds. Maybe she'd said finally. The point is that being there, just being there, doing the work, being exactly as good as you are, helps people you'll never meet in ways you'll never see for years you can't predict. A pause. Your father used to say something like that. Maya had gone quiet again. Not the quiet of someone with nothing to say. The quiet of someone who has just recognized something true. She had signed the form and registered. Now she folded her bracket assignment twice without looking at it, slid it into her pocket and walked toward the warm-up field. She had not heard Harrington's comment near the registration table. Several people around her had. She learned about it 20 minutes later from Voss, who was waiting at the edge of the warm-up field with 2 water bottles and an expression that communicated the situation without requiring words. Maya took one of the bottles. "What did he say exactly?" Voss told her. Maya unscrewed the cap and drank. She looked out at the warm-up field where a dozen soldiers were already moving through drills in the morning heat. Her face held the focused neutrality of someone who has heard difficult things before and learned to process them the way pilots process turbulence, not as a threat, but as information about conditions. "He's going to come after you specifically," Voss said. "Not just in the ring, before you even get there." "I know. The crowd is going to be complicated too." "I know that too." Voss studied her. In 22 years of service, she had worked alongside fighters of every variety and learned to read them the way you read terrain, not just the surface, but the structure underneath. What she saw in Maya Reeves's posture told her something specific. It told her that the internal work had already been done, that Maya had already been through the storm of doubt and calculation and come out the other side sometime before this morning in some private hour that no one else had witnessed. What remained now was simply waiting. Maya set down the water bottle and began her warm-up in the morning heat. The tournament format was straightforward. The hand-to-hand combat bracket ran across 2 days preliminary matches on day 1, semifinals and finals on day 2. Competitors were assigned across 4 weight and experience brackets. Matches operated under controlled contact rules with a tap or call submission standard. The refereeing team was drawn from senior non-commissioned officers with formal training evaluation credentials. For 10 consecutive years, the afternoon of Day 2 had produced the same result. This year, 3 people who did not appear on the official roster had driven to Fort Caldwell from Washington, D.C. Their paperwork described their visit as a training observation evaluation. It was not a training observation evaluation. Colonel Margaret Thorne had spent 22 years in special operations before moving to the Pentagon. She knew what she was looking for. She had learned over those years that the things worth finding rarely announce themselves in advance. She arrived at the registration area at 8:15 and positioned herself near the perimeter of the administration tent, a coffee cup in hand, watching. Maya's first match was scheduled for 9 o'clock. By 8:45, word had already moved through the base the way word moves through a closed community, fast, partially accurate, and amplified at every retelling. A woman had been placed in the combat bracket. Not a female officer in the observation stands. Not support personnel. An actual competitor with a record that the soldiers who bothered to look it up found quietly extraordinary. Top 4% of her SEAL training class. 2 combat deployments. A commendation for close quarters engagement that was partially classified, which meant the full details required a security clearance. Most of the soldiers present did not hold. The ones who found her file read it, went quiet, and then went to find their friends. "Have you seen this?" A different group had made up their minds the moment they heard Harrington's comment from across the registration area. Those soldiers were louder. When Maya walked out to the competition field at 9 o'clock, a sound moved through the crowd that wasn't quite a cheer and wasn't quite something else. It occupied the space between those two things, and it had teeth. She heard it. She registered it. She filed it away in the same place she filed wind direction and sightline calculations and everything else that was real information about real conditions. Then she looked at the field. Her first opponent was a Marine corporal named Hicks. 6 feet even, with the kind of upper body that suggested most of his off-duty hours went to the weight room. He had an honest face and an honest way of moving, and when he looked across the ring at Maya before the start signal, his expression held something that was almost apologetic, like he was about to do something that made him mildly uncomfortable. "I'm not going easy on you," he said low enough that only she could hear. "Good," she said. "Don't." The match lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. It was not a match of power against power. It was not a match of speed against speed. It was something more specific, and to the soldiers watching more difficult to process. Every time Hicks committed to a strike, Maya was no longer where the strike was going. Not fast, exactly. Precise. Her movement had the quality of something calculated one step ahead of the visible sequence, as if she were reading the intention before it became the action. When Hicks shifted his weight to power a throw, she had already read the weight shift and adjusted her position. When he drove forward with his lead shoulder to close distance, she pivoted at an angle that redirected his momentum without absorbing it. He was not being beaten by someone stronger. He was not being beaten by someone faster. He was being beaten by someone who had already decided where he was going before he knew it himself. The takedown that ended the match was clean and controlled. Hicks hit the mat, looked up at the morning sky for a moment, and tapped without drama. He stood, looked at Maya, and nodded once. The nod of a man recalculating something he had been confident about 30 minutes ago. The crowd's reaction was complicated in the way that honest reactions are always complicated. Some soldiers applauded openly without reservation. Others shifted on their feet. Others exchanged looks with the people standing beside them. The kind of look that isn't hostile and isn't warm, that sits in the middle distance of people processing information they weren't prepared for. From the far side of the field, Cole Harrington watched the entire match with his arms crossed and his jaw set. He said nothing when it ended. Garrett Finch, standing 12 feet to his left, noticed that Harrington had not looked away from the ring once in 4 minutes. Not once. The second match came 40 minutes later. The crowd around the field had doubled. Word does not travel slowly on a military base. By the time Maya walked out for her second match, 200 soldiers had positioned themselves around the competition area, roughly twice the usual number for a preliminary round. The retellings of the first fight had acquired layers of drama that may or may not have matched what actually happened, but the soldiers who had been there were quieter than the ones describing it secondhand. The ones who had watched carried something different in their faces, a quality of attention that hadn't been there at breakfast. Her second opponent was an Army corporal named Reed Calloway. He was 26, 210 pounds, with a wrestling background and the focused expression of a man who had spent part of the last 40 minutes watching the first fight from the second row and forming a strategy based on what he'd seen. He didn't look apologetic. He looked prepared. The referee signaled start, and Calloway moved immediately low, driving forward with his legs trying to close distance and take the fight to the ground where his wrestling would neutralize her speed advantage. It was a technically sound approach, logical. Against most opponents at this level, it would have been effective. Maya let him come. She sidestepped at the last possible moment, just enough to redirect his momentum rather than absorb it. As Calloway drove past her, she caught his arm at the elbow and redirected him into the mat with a control technique that looked from the viewing area almost gentle. Calloway rolled, recovered, came back up. The expression on his face had shifted, not frustrated, engaged. This was a real fight now, and he understood it. He adapted. That was the thing about Calloway. He was genuinely skilled and genuinely fast in his adjustments. He stopped trying to close distance with raw power and started working angles, testing her reactions, looking for patterns. 3 minutes in, he found one. A slight hesitation on her left side when she absorbed a check. He exploited it immediately, got inside her guard, and for 4 seconds held a dominant position. The crowd exhaled, and then Maya laughed. Not loud, not theatrical. A short, quiet sound, the kind that belongs to a sparring session between two people who both know exactly what they're doing. Half a second of genuine amusement, as if something had been confirmed that she'd been curious about. Calloway blinked. In that fraction of distraction, Maya had already reversed the position. She took him down 30 seconds later. Calloway tapped, sat up, and looked at her with an expression that held no hostility at all. "You're good," he said. "You're good too," she said. She meant it. You could hear that she meant it in the flat, factual way that professionals mean things when they have no reason to say them except that they're true. It was the most natural exchange anyone had witnessed on that field all morning, and for some reason, more than the technique, more than the takedown itself, it stayed with the soldiers who were watching, because Cole Harrington, in 3 years of winning this tournament, had never once said that to an opponent. The applause that followed was larger than before. Garrett Finch had joined the Army 2 years ago at 21 after a semester at community college in Ohio that had clarified nothing except that he needed structure. He was not the kind of soldier who made himself visible. He was the kind who watched and absorbed, who developed opinions slowly and held them quietly, who understood that being seen thinking the wrong thing in the wrong company had consequences that outlasted the thought. He had been standing within earshot of Harrington for most of the morning. He watched Harrington watch Maya's second match. He watched Harrington's right hand close slowly into a fist when the applause came. Then release. Close and release, like a pressure valve cycling under steady load. Later, near the equipment stations on the north side of the field, Finch stood beside Jake Whitfield, who was rewrapping a section of grip tape on a training bag and not looking at anything in particular. Whitfield's left sleeve had ridden up above the elbow in the heat, exposing the inside of his forearm. The scar was old pale against his skin, several inches long, with the irregular shape of something that had happened quickly and badly in the dark. Not a surgical line. Something else entirely. "Hell of a morning," Finch said, not about anything specific. Whitfield looked out toward the field. "Some SEAL pulled me out of a vehicle fire back in 2023, he said. And it was unclear whether he was responding to Finch or continuing a thought he'd been having on his own. "Night op outside Fallbrook. The whole thing went sideways fast. I don't know who it was. Never got a name, just hands coming through the door." Finch looked at him. Whitfield looked at his arm. Then he pulled the sleeve down and went back to the grip tape. Finch looked across the field to where Maya Reeves was cooling down at the water station alone and unhurried drinking from a metal canteen she'd brought herself. He stood there for a moment. Then he picked up his gear bag and walked in the opposite direction without saying anything further. Some things you needed time to think about before you open your mouth about them. By noon, the base was talking about nothing else. In the mess hall, in the equipment bays, and at every water station on the south field, the conversation pulled toward the same subject with the inevitability of water finding level. Soldiers who had watched the morning matches described them to soldiers who hadn't. The descriptions varied. The emphasis shifted depending on who was doing the talking and who was listening. But certain facts held across every version: she had won both matches cleanly. She had done it without arrogance. She had taken a dominant position against her, laughed, and taken the match back anyway. Cole Harrington sat at a table in the mess hall with 4 of his people and ate without speaking for 7 full minutes. This was notable. Harrington was the kind of man who filled silence as a matter of habit, who held the conversational floor the way some men hold territory, not because they need to say anything in particular, but because the empty space feels wrong to them. 7 minutes of silence from Cole Harrington was a duration that registered the way a change in air pressure registers. You felt it before you understood it. Whitfield eventually said carefully, "She's doing well this morning." Harrington looked up from his food. He looked at Whitfield the way a man looks at something that has said something technically accurate in a way that is somehow still wrong. Then he looked back at his tray. "She's doing well," he said, flat, final, like a door closing on a room he had no intention of entering. Nobody at the table said anything for a while after that. Then Harrington pushed his tray aside and unfolded the bracket sheet from his breast pocket. He laid it flat on the table and studied it, not the way you study something uncertain, but the way you study something that is already decided, and you are simply confirming the terms. His eyes moved down the column. He found the name. If the afternoon results continued as the morning had gone, she would be in his bracket in the morning. He folded the sheet and returned it to his pocket. Then he stood, walked to the side exit of the mess hall, and made a phone call. Finch, eating at a table with a sight line to the exit, could not hear the conversation. He could only see the set of Harrington's back and the stillness that came over him when the call connected. Harrington spoke for about 90 seconds. Then he ended the call and walked out into the afternoon heat without looking back. Finch set down his fork. He thought about the grip tape and the scar. He thought about the name on the bracket and the way Harrington's thumb had rested on it that morning. He thought about the specific quality of Harrington's silence at the table, which was not the silence of a man at rest, but the silence of a man doing arithmetic that no one else could see. Finch finished his lunch, cleared his tray, and went to find Command Sergeant Major Elias Burke's office. He didn't have enough yet, but he was starting to understand that he didn't have the luxury of waiting until he did. The afternoon matches ran until 5:30, and when they concluded, the bracket results were posted on the boards near the administration tent. A crowd gathered immediately. Not the polite, gradual accumulation of people who drift toward a posted list out of idle curiosity. This was purposeful soldiers who had been tracking the afternoon results and had positioned themselves near the boards deliberately. They pushed in close, reading over each other's shoulders, and then a current moved through the crowd. Not a sound exactly. A shift in the quality of the air. Two names now occupied the same bracket column for the following morning. Sergeant Cole Harrington. Petty Officer Maya Reeves, U.S. Navy SEAL. Private Tyler Sands had been on base for 3 months. He was 19 years old from a small town outside Savannah, Georgia, and he had joined because his grandfather had served, and the stories his grandfather told about service were the most serious things he had ever heard spoken out loud. He believed in what he'd signed up for. He didn't always understand it yet, but the belief was genuine, and he carried it carefully. He stared at the bracket board for a long time after the crowd began to thin. Then he found Finch near the fence line at the edge of the south field. "You've seen Harrington fight before," Sands said. "What happens tomorrow?" Finch considered the question from several directions before answering the way he considered most things. "I don't know," he said. Sands waited, expecting more. "That's the first time," Finch said quietly, "that I've been able to say that about one of his matches." He looked at the bracket board from across the field at the two names printed side by side in the fading afternoon light. "I don't know if that's good or bad. I just know it's different from anything we've seen here before." Sands thought about that. He was 19 years old and still learning the difference between the things that mattered and the things that merely seemed to. "Ask me tomorrow," Finch said. That night, the base settled into the restlessness of a place that knows something is coming. In the preparation room allocated to competitors on the south end of the field, a light stayed on past midnight. Maya sat with her back against the wall, and 16 pages of match history spread across the floor in front of her. Voss had requested the file that afternoon and delivered it without comment, setting it inside the door and leaving without asking questions. Maya had read every page twice. Cole Harrington's record showed 41 tournament wins, 9 by early decision, the rest by expanding margins as opponents attempted to match his physical intensity and found the gap widening rather than closing the longer the match went. His style was built around pressure and aggression, the systematic application of force in one direction until something gave way. He was technically proficient. He was psychologically dominant. He came to competition the way certain men come to everything, with the absolute expectation of a particular outcome. One loss on record. 4 years ago, a senior instructor who had since retired. Maya read the description of that loss twice. The instructor had won by refusing to fight on Harrington's terms. He had not matched aggression with aggression. He had been patient. He had controlled the pace from outside the range where Harrington's power was most dangerous, and he had made Harrington come to him again and again until Harrington's forward drive became the instrument of his own undoing. Maya set the papers down and looked at the ceiling. She thought about her father. She had been thinking about him in the settled, constant way of someone whose presence you still carry long after they're gone, the way a voice stays with you after the conversation has ended. Colonel James Reeves had died 2 years ago in a training accident at a facility in Virginia. Not combat, a training accident. There was a particular cruelty in that distinction that Maya had turned over many times and still hadn't made peace with a man who had survived 2 wars and 3 combat deployments taken by something ordinary. The world doesn't always assign its endings with logic you can recognize. She had been 10 years old the first time he showed her a defensive hold. Not aggressive. Defensive. In the driveway of their house outside Tucson, in the Arizona heat, wearing shoes that were slightly too large because she'd grown faster than he'd anticipated. He had crouched down to her level and placed her hands at the correct angles and said the thing he always said, the sentence she heard now in moments when the stakes were real. The goal is never to hurt someone. The goal is to stop being hurt. If you know the difference, you'll always fight cleaner than someone who doesn't. She gathered the papers from the floor, folded them, and put them away. Then she lay down on the narrow cot and looked at the dark ceiling and let herself breathe. Tomorrow was coming whether she was ready for it or not. She planned to be ready. Across the base in the equipment room adjacent to the North Training Facility, another light stayed on past midnight. Cole Harrington had been working the heavy bag since 10 o'clock. Not for conditioning. He didn't need conditioning at this point in his career. He worked the bag the way some men pace, not to get somewhere, but because the alternative was stillness. And stillness meant the thoughts got louder. He worked in silence and in the specific economy of a man who has done this so many times that his body performs it without instruction, which left his mind free to go where it was going to go, regardless which was to the name on the bracket sheet in his pocket and everything that name carried with it. Reeves. There are names that hold weight beyond the person who bears them, names that arrive with history already attached, the weight of what was built under them and what was broken and what was left unresolved when they went away. Harrington had been hearing that name in his head for 2 years. He had believed for most of those 2 years that he had made a kind of peace with it. He understood now, hitting the bag in the silence of a Texas night, that he had been wrong about that. He had never made peace with it. He had only learned to keep it far enough away that it couldn't reach him. Tomorrow, it was going to be 6 feet across a competition ring. He hit the bag harder and did not think about what that meant. Outside Fort Caldwell lay quiet under the Texas stars. 500 soldiers sleeping or nearly sleeping, the competition field empty in the darkness. The ring standing without ceremony in the warm night air. Patient, the way all stages are patient. Indifferent to who comes to stand in them and what they bring. In the morning, something was going to happen on that field that no one on this base had seen before. Most of them were asleep and didn't know it yet. 3 of them were still awake, and one of them was lying on a cot in a preparation room with her father's voice in her ear and 16 pages of a man's history folded neatly in her bag, thinking about patience and distance and the particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself until the moment it's needed most. The second morning arrived the way trouble always arrives on a military base, quietly at first, then all at once. By 5:30, before the mess hall had finished its first breakfast rotation, Fort Caldwell already knew 2 things. The first was that Maya Reeves had gone undefeated through every match the previous day. The second was that she was now in Cole Harrington's bracket. Those 2 facts together created a specific kind of atmosphere on the base, the kind you could feel in how people held their coffee cups in, how conversations stopped when the wrong person walked nearby, and how even the youngest soldiers understood instinctively that the day ahead was not an ordinary day, even if they couldn't have explained the reasons precisely. Garrett Finch had been awake since 4:45. He told himself it was the cot. The cots in the shared quarters building were notoriously bad, thin mattresses, frames that creaked with intention, and he had complained about his at least a dozen times since arriving at Fort Caldwell 3 months ago. But lying in the gray pre-dawn, watching the ceiling lighten by degrees, he knew it wasn't the cot. It was the phone call. He had watched Harrington make it from the mess hall exit the previous afternoon. 90 seconds. Harrington had stood with his back to the base, shoulders set, speaking to someone he had chosen to call while standing apart from everyone else. After 2 years alongside the man, Finch had learned to read the difference between the phone calls that were administrative and the ones that were something else. The set of Harrington's back had told him this was something else entirely. At 5:55, he got up, dressed, and walked to Command Sergeant Major Elias Burke's office. Burke was already there. He was always already there, which had stopped surprising people years ago. He was 62 years old, thin, with the specific economy of expression that comes from having said everything important so many times that you no longer feel the need to frame it. He looked at Finch standing in his doorway and gestured at the chair across from his desk without words. Finch sat. He reported everything in the precise, factual sequence his training required, not editorializing, not interpreting, just the facts as he had observed them. The way Harrington had looked at the name Reeves on the bracket sheet. Whitfield's comment about the phone call the night before. The quality of Harrington's silence in the mess hall. The way his hand had closed and released during Maya's applause. The phone call from the exit. Burke listened without interrupting. When Finch finished, the CSM was quiet for a full 10 seconds. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and placed a thin folder on the surface between them. "This was submitted to my office 2 nights ago," Burke said. "And 3 months ago a previous version was submitted and closed." He opened the folder. Inside was a formal complaint, neatly typed, citing procedural grounds for Maya Reeves's removal from the combat bracket, a technicality involving the classification level of her SEAL service record and its compatibility with open tournament participation. The language was careful, administrative, written by someone who knew exactly which words to use. Finch looked at it for a moment. "He's done this before," he said. Not a question. 3 months ago, when her entry was first submitted. Burke closed the folder. I close both complaints under my discretionary authority. Reeves's participation is fully compliant. He looked at Finch with the kind of directness that doesn't require volume. You're putting your name on this conversation? Yes, Sergeant Major. Burke nodded once. He reached for his radio. He made 3 calls, the language brief and specific. Additional oversight protocol review the 2 o'clock match. When he set the radio down, he looked at Finch again. Go get breakfast, he said. And Finch. Finch paused at the door. You did the right thing coming here, Burke said. That's all. Finch walked back across the base in the early morning light, past the quiet competition field, past the equipment buildings where generators hummed at low idle. He thought about Whitfield's arm. He thought about 2 complaint forms separated by 3 months. He thought about a man who had tried twice through official channels to make sure a specific name never appeared across from his on a bracket sheet. Whatever Cole Harrington was afraid of, it had a name. And the name was Reeves. Maya was on the warm-up field at 6:15. She was not shadowboxing. She was not running. She sat cross-legged at the edge of the grass with her eyes closed and her hands resting loose on her knees, breathing in a slow count that made her look less like a combat athlete and more like someone who had found an interior room that the noise outside couldn't reach. Sandra Voss arrived at 6:20 with 2 coffees. She stopped when she saw Maya's posture. She stood for a moment, both cups in hand, and simply watched. In 22 years of military service, Voss had learned to read pre-competition stillness, the way you read weather as information about what kind of day you were going to have. What she read in Maya's posture was specific and unmistakable. It told her the internal work was done, that whatever storm of doubt and calculation and fear had been there in the small hours, Maya had moved through it and arrived somewhere on the other side. What remained now was not preparation. It was the silence after preparation, which is a different thing entirely. Voss sat down beside her and held out a coffee. Maya opened her eyes and took it. Thank you. He was in the training room at 5 this morning, Voss said. Running hard. I heard from 2 people independently. Maya took a sip of coffee. He's scared, she said. Voss looked at her. Harrington doesn't get scared. Everyone gets scared. Maya said it without emphasis, the way you say something that has been true for so long it no longer needs defending. The ones who can't admit it turn it into something else. She looked at her coffee cup. He's turned it into fury, which means he's going to come at me harder than he's ever come at anyone. A pause. And make mistakes he wouldn't normally make. Voss was quiet for a moment. And you? Maya looked out at the field. The morning light was low and flat, stretching long shadows across the grass from the fence posts along the perimeter. She thought about the 16 pages folded in her bag. She thought about the 1 loss on Harrington's record, and the words the retired instructor had used, and the thing her father had said to her when she was 12 years old in the driveway in Tucson after she'd gotten frustrated trying to work a technique that wasn't coming together. Patience isn't the same as waiting, he'd told her. Patience is watching. There's always a moment. You don't create it. You just have to be ready when it arrives. She looked at Voss. I don't have anything to prove today, she said. I proved it yesterday. Every match. She stood and brushed the grass from her shorts. What I have today is an obligation. To who? She picked up the coffee cup. To the work, she said simply. And she walked onto the field and began to move. The morning round began at 8. Harrington's early matches were not elegant. They were not designed to be. He moved through his first 2 opponents with the contained brutality of a man who is not fighting the people in front of him, but rehearsing for the fight that comes after. His first opponent, a young Army corporal who had performed well the previous day, was finished in under 90 seconds. The second lasted 3 minutes only because Harrington seemed to extend it deliberately, as if making a specific point about endurance to an audience he wanted to have watching. The crowd responded to him the way it always had. Loudly, with the specific admiration given to men who embody an obvious and uncomplicated kind of power. But something underneath the noise was different from previous years, and Colonel Margaret Thorne, standing 30 feet back with her coffee and her unhurried attention, felt it clearly. The crowd was divided. Not evenly, but genuinely. A significant portion of the soldiers watching Harrington's morning matches were not cheering. Some were watching with neutral faces. Some with something harder to name, a quality of assessment, as if they were measuring something that previous years had seemed settled and this year had reopened. The base had shifted overnight. Harrington hadn't registered it yet. Maya's morning match came at 9:40. Her opponent was a staff sergeant named Marcus Foley. Foley was not the kind of fighter who needed an introduction, though most people gave him one anyway. He had competed professionally before enlisting and carried a record that belonged on a different kind of resume. He was intelligent, experienced, and possessed the loose, unhurried confidence of a man who has stood in front of crowds so many times that crowds no longer produce anything in him except calibration. He had watched Maya's matches from the previous day with focused attention and had spent part of the evening talking to people who had been ringside. He came to the match prepared. He didn't overcommit. He didn't try to overwhelm her with size. He worked angles, kept distance, made the fight technical, precise exchanges at range, testing her reactions, building a picture of her timing. For the first 2 minutes, the match was close enough that the scoring referee watched every second without blinking. Then at 2 minutes and 40 seconds, Maya made a small adjustment. It was subtle enough that most of the crowd missed it entirely. A slight shift in her footwork, her lead foot moving 1 inch further outside than it had been in previous exchanges, changing her angle of approach by a degree that looked insignificant and was anything but. She had identified something in Foley's defensive recovery, a fraction of a second delay in his right side after an outgoing exchange, and she had begun building toward it the way her father had taught her to build toward a conclusion. Not rushing, laying the groundwork 3 steps before she needed it. At 3 minutes and 20 seconds, the opening arrived. Her hands moved in a sequence that was not in any formal curriculum. A specific placement of her left hand at the inside of Foley's forearm, the angle precise to within a few degrees, the grip pressure calibrated, the follow-through, using his forward momentum as the primary force of the technique. It was not a textbook hold. It was something passed from one person to another in the specific and irreproducible way that real knowledge moves not through manuals, but through repetition, correction, and the patient attention of a teacher who understood that the goal was not to reproduce a technique but to make it belong to the student completely. Foley felt it the moment her hands found the position. He went still for half a second. Not frozen. Still. The stillness of recognition of something clicking into place in the mind before the body has finished processing what the hands already know. Then the technique completed and he hit the mat cleanly and he tapped and the match was over. He sat up. He looked at her. The crowd was making noise. Neither of them was listening to it. Foley said something low enough that only Maya could hear. He said it with the even tone of a man confirming something he needed to be certain about. "That's the Reeves Hold." Maya looked at him. "Your father trained me," Foley said. 3 years ago before I re-enlisted. Private sessions twice a week for 6 months. He stood unhurried, brushing the mat dust from his sleeve. His voice carried the same quality it always did, level without performance. "He talked about you every session. I mean every one. Not bragging. Just you came up. The way certain things come up when they matter to someone." He paused. "He said you'd be the best student he ever trained, that you understood something most people only learn to imitate." Maya stood completely still. Not the controlled stillness of her warm-up. Something different. Something that had a cost. Foley nodded once. He extended his hand and she shook it. Then he picked up his gear and walked off the field. Maya turned and walked to the water station at the edge of the competition area. She drank from her canteen. She stood with her back to the field for approximately 30 seconds. Her breathing was even. Her hands were steady. When she turned back around, her expression had returned to the focused neutrality that the crowd had been watching all morning. But Voss, standing at the rope line 15 feet away, had seen those 30 seconds. She had seen what moved across Maya's face before the control came back. She made a note of it the way you make a note of something that matters without needing to discuss it. From across the field, Cole Harrington had also been watching. He had seen Foley's stillness when Maya's hands found the grip. He had seen the specific way that stillness landed on Foley, not as a technique being applied, but as something being recognized. And because Harrington had studied under James Reeves for 2 years at the beginning of his career, before things had gone the way they went, he understood exactly what Foley had recognized. He turned and walked to the far end of the warm-up area and stood with his hands at his sides and looked at nothing in particular. The crowd was still applauding behind him. He didn't hear it. The final bracket was posted at 11. Harrington versus Reeves. 2 o'clock, 3 hours. Those 3 hours had a texture on the base that was unlike anything the previous 10 years of this tournament had produced. Time moved differently, too slow in the long stretches, suddenly too fast near the end. Soldiers who had afternoon duties found reasons to be near the competition field by 1:45. The mess hall cleared faster than usual at lunch. Even the base operations center, which had its own rhythms independent of any tournament, was running lean on personnel by 1:30 because the people who were supposed to be there had found reasons to be elsewhere. At 1:55, Maya stood at the edge of the competition field. The crowd around the ring was the largest it had been for any match in 11 years of the showcase. Soldiers were standing 4 and 5 deep in some sections. The perimeter ropes were working hard. The sound was low and continuous, the specific hum of 500 people restraining the same collective impulse. Voss stood beside her. "He knows about your father," Maya said. Not a question. Voss looked at her. "What do you mean?" "He knows who he was. They have history." She said it without drama, as if she were reporting a wind direction. "I've been looking at his record for 2 days. There's a gap in his early career, 18 months, no tournament results, no formal training documentation. That's when my father was mentoring privately." She looked at the ring. "Whatever happened between them, it didn't end well." Voss was quiet for a moment. "Does that change anything?" Maya considered the question the way she considered things that deserved a real answer. "It explains the anger," she said. "It doesn't change the work." She rolled her shoulders back, exhaled once, and walked toward the ring. Cole Harrington arrived at the ring at 1:58. He did not walk the way he usually walked, with the loose, easy authority of a man who has already decided the outcome. He moved with the precise economy of something that has stripped itself down to function. Gray training shirt sleeves cut. No swagger, no performance. Just a man who had spent the previous night in a training room, in the morning in the bracket, and the last 3 hours somewhere interior that nobody else had access to. He did not look at Maya. That itself was a tell, and every person in the crowd who understood fighting registered it at some level, even if they couldn't have named what they were seeing. Harrington always looked at his opponents during warm-up. He made a point of it, finding their eyes holding contact, establishing that he owned the space before a single exchange had occurred. The fact that he was deliberately not looking at Maya meant she was already inside his head, occupying so much of it that he couldn't afford the cost of direct contact. Garrett Finch, standing at the rope line 20 feet away, registered this and said nothing. The referee called both fighters to the center. 500 soldiers went quiet. Colonel Thorne, standing in the back with her 2 colleagues, uncrossed her arms and leaned forward by a fraction, a movement so small that neither person standing beside her noticed it, but which represented, for a woman of her discipline and her years, something close to the edge of her seat. Burke had positioned 2 additional senior referees at the ring's perimeter. Nobody announced this. Nobody explained it. But Finch saw them arrive and felt something in his chest ease by a small degree. The referee looked at Harrington, looked at Maya. Tournament rules apply. Controlled contact. Tap or call for submission. Any escalation beyond sanction results in immediate disqualification. He said it to both of them. The words were aimed at one. Harrington stared past him. Maya looked at the referee and nodded once. "Ready?" Harrington set his jaw. "Ready." Maya exhaled. The referee stepped back, and Harrington moved. He came forward fast, faster than his size suggested was possible, with the focused aggression of a man who had decided in the dark hours of early morning that this match was not going to last long enough for patience to become relevant. He threw a combination designed not just to score, but to establish immediately and completely that he was the largest force in the ring, and that everything else would happen on his terms. Maya moved left, not back. Left outside his power line, where his combination ended in empty air. He turned and came again. She moved right. The crowd made a sound that was not a cheer, the sound of 500 people simultaneously registering that what they were watching was not what they had expected. His third combination was harder, faster. His full weight committed to it, the kind of attack that had ended most of his fights before the first minute was over. Maya wasn't there when it arrived. She had already moved, and in the space where his momentum carried him fractionally past his own balance point, she was at his side, redirecting rather than absorbing, applying pressure at the precise angle of his overextension. Harrington stumbled, recovered, turned. His expression had changed. The calculation was gone. Something raw had replaced it, not yet rage, but moving in that direction with the specific velocity of a large object on a slope. 2 minutes in, he stopped in the center of the ring. His chest moved. His eyes were on her. For the first time in 3 years of winning this tournament, for the first time in 11 years of this event, Cole Harrington stood in the center of a competition ring and did not know what to do next. The crowd felt it. Even the soldiers who had spent the previous 24 hours insisting he would dismantle her felt it, because you cannot hide that moment. Not in front of 500 people. Not when senior officers are watching from the sideline and cameras are recording every angle and 3 people from the Pentagon are standing 30 feet back. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Harrington did what men like him always do when strategy runs out. He got loud. "Stop dancing." His voice had an edge that wasn't quite a crack but was close, the sound of something under pressure approaching its limit. "Fight me. Stop running and fight me like you mean it." Maya didn't answer. She reset her weight, controlled her breathing, watched his center mass. That silence hit him harder than any counterstrike could have, because he had been using his voice as a weapon his entire career. The taunts, the volume, the performative contempt, all of it designed to reach inside an opponent's head and make them react emotionally, make them sloppy, make them his. Maya treated his voice like weather. She accounted for it and moved on. "Say something." He stepped forward, and there was no technique in the step, only emotion moving a large body. "You think you're better than me? You think what you did yesterday means anything here? Say it." From the sideline, Finch watched Harrington's footwork and felt his stomach contract, because Harrington was moving without a plan, operating on something that preceded calculation. And a man of his size and training moving on pure emotion in a competition ring was not a controlled situation. It was a countdown. Burke had already tilted his head slightly toward the senior referee at the near post. At 2 minutes and 30 seconds, Harrington changed tactics. He stopped throwing combinations and started trying to close distance, get his weight involved, use the size differential that had ended so many matches before. He drove forward, grinding rather than striking, trying to exhaust her defense through attrition. He got inside her guard once. For 6 seconds, he had positioned his mass working in his favor, forward pressure building. Maya was holding, redirecting, and the effort of it showed in a way the earlier exchanges hadn't. The crowd leaned forward, and Harrington felt the crowd lean. And in that fraction of a second, in the precise moment he stopped reading Maya and started performing for the people watching, she felt the shift in his weight and found what she had been building toward for the last 4 minutes. The reversal was faster than the crowd could follow. One moment Harrington had position. The next, Maya had rotated through a movement that used his own forward pressure as its primary force, his weight, his aggression, his 3 years of certainty, and Harrington was face down toward the mat, her controlling his arm at an angle that was precise and final and very close to the edge of what the joint was designed to tolerate. He didn't tap. Tap or call Harrington. His jaw was against the mat. His free hand was flat on the ground. Tap or call. Through teeth clenched hard enough to ache, out. The referee heard it. He signaled the exchange. Maya released immediately and stepped back. Harrington got up. He always got up. In 15 years, in every match, in every circumstance, he always got up. It was not courage exactly. It was more fundamental, the only option his body understood. He rose to his feet in the center of the ring, and the look on his face was not the face of a man fighting to win anymore. It was the face of a man who had run out of everything except the truth he had been carrying for 15 years. And the truth was right across from him, smaller and younger and belonging to a name he had been trying to outrun since before she was old enough to know his existed. He walked toward her, not rushed, almost slow. The slowness of someone who has stopped calculating outcomes entirely. "You think that counts?" His voice was very low now, not for the crowd, only for her. "You think any of this means what you think it means?" Maya reset her stance. She watched his hips, not his hands. "Your father called me," Harrington said. His voice had changed again. The edge was gone. What replaced it was worse, Something stripped and direct, the voice of a man saying something he has rehearsed in private and never intended to say out loud. 2 months before he died, he called me. The words came without inflection, without performance, one after the other, in the flat sequence of something that has been held inside for a long time. He asked me to look out for you. He said you were going to do something that mattered. He asked me to be there if you needed someone. Harrington's chest was still moving from the match. His eyes were steady. I told him to save his breath. 500 people had stopped breathing. The referee stood very still. Voss at the rope line felt something move through her, that she didn't have a name for a specific grief that belongs to the moment when you understand fully the weight of what someone carried without telling you. Tyler Sands, 19 years old, standing in the 5th row, understood before he could have explained why, that what he was witnessing was not a fight anymore. It had stopped being a fight. He wasn't sure what it was instead. Maya stood completely still. 1 second, 2. The air in the ring held everything: the heat of the Texas afternoon, the silence of 500 people, the specific and irreversible weight of words that have been said out loud after living too long in the dark. Then Maya exhaled. Once. Controlled. And something happened in her eyes that was visible to everyone watching, though most of them couldn't have described it precisely. A deepening, a settling. Not anger, not grief. Something that lived below both of those, the quality of a person who has been handed the full truth and has chosen in real time what to do with it. She set her feet. She became in that moment more dangerous than she had been at any point in the previous 2 days. The referee's voice came sharp and clear. Both fighters reset. Harrington moved. Lower this time, smarter, his best remaining strategy, closing distance, making the fight about attrition. He drove in hard. Maya slipped his entry by 2 inches and landed 2 short, precise strikes to his ribs. Not theatrical, just accurate. The kind of strikes that don't look like much from 20 feet back and communicate very precisely to the body that registers them. I know exactly where you are. You do not know where I am. Harrington sucked in a breath and reset. 1 minute remaining. He came again. The same closing drive, adjusted lower angle, harder push. He got inside for a moment, weight pressing forward, and Maya gave him that pressure. She yielded just enough. His weight committed. And the moment his momentum fully engaged the space she had opened, she was already rotating her hips, driving the movement, his own force becoming the instrument of what happened next. He went down, not falling. Down completely and immediately, the way a body goes when physics has settled the question before the mind finishes processing. He hit the mat with a sound that was large and final, and he lay there. The referee moved in. The medical team was already moving before the referee reached center ring. Harrington lay on his back, looking at the afternoon sky over Fort Caldwell, Texas. He was conscious. He was not getting up. His right leg was at an angle that told its own story without words, and his face had gone the specific color of a body encountering more structural damage than it had planned for. He had kicked. Full force. No control, no technique. The raw violence of a man who had run out of every other option and reached for the one thing that was never an option at all. The referee had been moving before the kick landed. Maya had been moving the moment she read his weight shift. She had stepped in. Her hands had found his leg mid-arc, the way hands find something they have trained 10,000 times to find, not by decision, but by preparation, so deep it had become instinct. She had caught it. She had redirected it. And the physics of what followed were simple and complete, and had nothing to do with intent. She stood 3 feet from him now. She did not look triumphant. She did not look broken. She looked at the man on the ground with an expression that Foley, watching from 30 feet back, would later describe as the most serious thing he had ever seen on a human face. Not satisfaction, not victory. The expression of someone who has witnessed something become real and irreversible and is standing in the full weight of it without flinching and without looking away. Voss was in the ring before the medical team. She put one hand on Maya's arm and said nothing for several seconds. "I'm okay," Maya said. "I know you are. I know." Maya looked at Harrington on the ground, at the medical team arriving, at the 500 soldiers standing in total extraordinary silence, at Burke with his radio up, at Thorne 30 feet back. who was looking directly at her with an expression that was for the first time since she'd arrived at Fort Caldwell entirely readable. "I didn't mean for his leg," Maya said quietly. "The camera saw everything," Voss said. "All 7 angles. You caught an illegal strike that was already in motion. What happened to his leg was physics, not intent." She held Maya's gaze with the certainty of someone who has already examined the question from every direction. "You are not responsible for the choices he made." Maya nodded once. She looked at Harrington one more time. At the man who had known her father, had been trusted by her father, had been given an opportunity by her father, and had failed to meet it. At the man who had spent 15 years building something over the ruin of that failure, and had finally today run out of room to run from it. She looked at him with the same seriousness she had given every opponent in this tournament, which is to say she looked at him as a person, as something real and consequential, as someone who mattered, which is the most difficult thing to grant to someone who has tried hard to make you feel otherwise. Then she turned and walked toward the rope line. The crowd, which had maintained its silence for nearly a full minute, an extraordinary duration, an almost sacred one, began to find its voice. And it parted ahead of her without anyone organizing it, without any signal, simply because 500 people understood in the same instant that this woman needed a path, and giving it to her was the only right thing left to do. The stretcher cleared the competition field at 3:17 in the afternoon. 500 soldiers watched Harrington go horizontal, jaw set, conscious and not speaking. And the corridor of silence they created along the path to the perimeter road was the most honest thing Fort Caldwell had produced all week. Nobody organized it, nobody had to. Some silences are instinctive. Maya did not watch him go. She was already at the rope line, moving through the crowd that parted ahead of her the way it had come together all week, without signal, without coordination. Simply the collective understanding of 500 people that this woman needed a path, and they were going to give her one. She moved with her head up and her hands loose at her sides, the forward motion of someone who has done what needed to be done, and is not going to stop moving until she has put some distance between herself and the ring. Tyler Sands, standing in the 5th row, watched her pass 6 feet in front of him. He was 19 years old and from a small town outside Savannah, and he had joined because his grandfather had served, and his grandfather's stories about service were the most serious things he had ever heard spoken aloud. He watched Maya Reeves walk through that corridor of silence and felt something in his chest recalibrate quietly, permanently, the way certain things shift when you are young enough that the world is still capable of genuinely surprising you. She didn't look triumphant, she didn't look broken, she looked like someone carrying something real, which is entirely different from being defeated by it, which is in fact the opposite. The first phone was up before the medical team reached the perimeter road. Not to record, 7 cameras had been recording from the start. This was uploading. It moved the way fire moves in dry conditions, finding pathways, jumping gaps, accelerating where conditions were right. 400,000 views by 4 in the afternoon, 2 million by 6. A retired professional analyst watched it once, then again, then went on air and said what Maya had done with her hands in the final 4 seconds was either extraordinary instinct or extraordinary training, and that in 20 years covering combat sport, he had rarely seen them be the same thing. That segment alone reached 2 million views before midnight. Fort Caldwell went quiet in the way that places go quiet after something irreversible, not peace, but the suspension of the familiar, while the mind catches up to what the eyes have seen. Burke's office, late afternoon, metal desk, legal pad. Maya sat across from him and reported in the precise sequence her training required Harrington's approach, the feinted takedown, the kick, already in motion, hands finding the leg, mid-arc rotation result. Facts. Sequence. No interpretation. Burke listened without writing. When she finished, he was quiet for 10 seconds. Then, 7 angles. The investigation is a formality. He set the pen down. There are also 2 complaint forms in this file with Harrington's name on them. One submitted 3 months ago, one the night before the match. Both attempting your removal from the bracket on procedural grounds. Both closed under my discretionary authority. Both are now part of the investigation record. Maya looked at him steadily. I wasn't aware of them. You weren't meant to be. He picked up the pen, set it back down. Finch's report is in the file, noted as action consistent with military values and chain of command responsibility. He held her gaze. Anything else you want on record? Finch did the right thing, she said. I want that in writing. Burke wrote it down. Outside in the corridor, Voss fell into step beside her. You doing all right? Ask me in a week, Maya said, and kept walking. The finding came 71 hours later, 18 pages. Maya was on the south field running interval sprints when Voss appeared at the perimeter with a printed summary. She read it between sets, standing with her hands on her knees and her breath coming in controlled pulls. 3 sentences. Petty Officer Maya Reeves had acted in response to an illegal strike already in motion. Her response was proportional to the threat presented. No punitive action was warranted. She handed the paper back to Voss, reset her position at the line, and ran the next interval. Harrington received a formal reprimand, a suspension of instructor duties pending review, and a referral to the Conduct Assessment Board. His legal representation issued a statement suggesting the investigation had been compromised by public attention. Maya read it in Voss's office, set it aside without comment, and returned to her schedule. Some things deserved a response. Some things deserved only the continuation of the work. She gave one interview, a single session on her terms. A veteran journalist named Douglas Marsh, who had covered military affairs for nearly 2 decades, and who, to his credit, had read everything before sitting down. He led with the question everyone wanted answered. Do you see yourself as a symbol? Maya was pulling a water bottle from her bag when he asked it. She straightened, unscrewed the cap, took a drink. No, she said. I see myself as a Navy SEAL who competed in a tournament and defended herself when the rules stopped being followed. She looked at him without performance. If that becomes a symbol to someone, that's their experience. I can't control what my actions mean to other people. I can only control what they mean to me. And what do they mean to you? They mean my father's training worked, she said. That's the whole story. The network ran it in full. No commentary before or after. 6 million views in 48 hours, because sometimes the plainest truth is the one that travels farthest. 3 weeks after the match, Colonel Margaret Thorne called and asked for 10 minutes. Maya arrived from the field still in her training gear, sweat drying on her collar tape still wrapped on her left wrist. Thorne was waiting in a small conference room with a padded envelope on the table and the expression of a woman who has been holding something for a long time and is finally setting it down. The handwriting on the envelopes outside was her father's. For Maya. Open when it's time. J. Reeves. Thorne explained, given in person at a facility in Virginia approximately 6 months before he died. He knew he was ill. He said she would know when the right moment arrived. He said it would be unmistakable. Then Thorne walked out and closed the door and did not look back. Maya picked up the envelope. She did not open it there. She drove to the 2-mile perimeter road she had been running every morning since the match, parked at the edge of the lot, opened the envelope in the front seat. A USB drive. Nothing else. She loaded the file, put one earbud and pressed play. Then she got out of the vehicle and started running. Her father's voice came through the left ear as her feet found the familiar rhythm of the perimeter road. The morning was still gray at the edges, pale light gathering at the tree line to the east. She ran and she listened, not stopping, not sitting, moving through his words the way she had always moved through hard things, body forward, breathing, steady, mind open. He talked about the work, the long, patient work of building something in another person that outlasts you. The specific joy, he used the word joy, which he had not often used, of watching a student reach the point where they no longer need the teacher. He said teaching had been the best work of his life. He meant it without qualification, including in relation to combat. He talked about her, not at length. He had never been a man of length. He said she understood something about fighting that most people only learn to imitate, and that the difference between understanding and imitation was the difference between a skill and a character. He said character was what remained when everything else stripped away. He talked about Cole Harrington near the end. 2 years early career. Gifted, genuinely gifted. But he had wanted results faster than the work could produce them. And when Reeves told him that Harrington heard judgment instead of guidance, they parted badly. Partly Reeves's failure. He should have found different words. He had thought about reaching out for years. Finally had a few months before the recording. Harrington hadn't picked up. Maya ran the southern curve of the perimeter road, where the fence turned and the base operations building rose gray against the brightening sky. She ran and listened. Don't carry his failure, Maya. It was never yours to carry. And whatever happens between the two of you, if anything ever does, know that I already handled my part of it. A pause. The sound of a man breathing. I'm proud of you. I've been proud of you since before you gave me a reason to say it, which is the only way pride is worth anything. The recording ended. She ran the last quarter mile of the loop in silence, finished where she started, stopped her watch and stood with her hands on her hips in the gray morning air breathing. Her face was wet. Some of it was sweat. She drove back to base and went to her first training block of the morning. 180 miles south in a rehabilitation clinic in San Antonio, Cole Harrington learned to walk again. This was not a metaphor. This was the specific and unglamorous labor of a body relearning a function it had performed automatically for 35 years and was now required to rebuild from the hardware outward. 2 titanium screws and a plate. The limp was permanent, a slight, unmistakable irregularity present in every step belonging to him. Now the way certain decisions belong to a person long after they have stopped making them. The physical therapist was a former Army medic named Galt. Compact, direct, no interest in softening outcomes. He told Harrington what the recovery required, what the realistic result would be, said it once clearly, and moved to the work. The work was this: stand, bear weight, take a step, do it again. Harrington did it every morning for 3 months. Every morning the hardware communicated through the specific language of structural protest that the leg was doing something it had not been designed to do in quite this configuration. He did not complain about it. Complaining required an audience, and he had stopped performing for audiences. He bore the weight and took the steps and did it again the following morning, because doing it again was the only option his body had ever understood, and it was not going to stop understanding it now. In the afternoons in the clinic bed with time he had never had before and could not usefully fill, he watched coverage he had made a point of not searching for in the first weeks. Then one evening he searched for it anyway. Because you need to know exactly how bad things are before you can decide what to do next. He watched the clip 11 times. The 12th time he turned off the sound and watched only Maya's face. The 12 seconds after he went down. He had been looking at the sky during those seconds. He had not seen her expression in real time. He was encountering it now through a camera angle positioned 30 feet up and to his left. She was looking at him the way you look at something that has become real and irreversible. Without triumph. Without contempt. The full weight attention of someone who understands that what has just happened matters and refuses to pretend it doesn't. He turned off the screen. He asked the night nurse for a pen and paper. Not his phone. Paper. He sat in the bed with the paper against a medical tray leg. Elevated hardware doing what hardware does at the end of a long day, and he began to write. 3 hours. 4 attempts. The first 3 went in the trash. Not because they were dishonest, but because they were honest about the wrong things. They explained. They contextualized. They were written by a man who still wanted to be understood before he was judged. The 4th draft was written by a man who had stopped wanting that. 7 paragraphs. He did not reread them. He folded the pages into an envelope, addressed it to Petty Officer Maya Reeves at Fort Caldwell, and placed it in the outgoing mail tray before he could change his mind. He did not know whether she would open it. He thought perhaps she shouldn't. He sent it anyway because some things need to be said even when you have forfeited the right to expect a response. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Voss left it inside Maya's door without comment. The return address made comment unnecessary. Maya found it when she came in from the evening training block, still in her gear hands, still taped boots, still on. She set it on the table while she stripped the tape, washed her hands, drank from a water bottle. Then she sat down with it in the chair by the window, still in her training clothes, and opened it. The handwriting was deliberate, slowed considerably from whatever pace he normally moved at. He did not make excuses. She registered this immediately because it was the most important thing. No circumstances, no history offered in his defense, no request to understand him. He said plainly that he had been wrong not just in the ring but before it, in the complaint forms, and the contempt, and the 15 years of treating her surname as an injury he was entitled to answer. He said she had stopped him the only way available to her. He said her composure had shown him something about himself he had been successfully avoiding for the entirety of his career. He said he was sorry. Not sorry he had been hurt. Sorry for what he had done. The last paragraph she read 4 times. The night your father called, he wrote, I was at a bar outside the base celebrating a win. I saw his name come up on my phone. I looked at it for a long time. Then I set the phone face down on the bar and ordered another drink. He called twice more. I didn't pick up either time. I found out he had died 6 weeks later from someone in a training context who mentioned it in passing, not knowing I knew him. I have thought about that night every single day since. I am not writing this to make you feel sorry for me. I am writing it because you deserve to know, and because I owed him something I cannot pay back, and this is the closest I can get. Maya set the letter down. She got up, went to the cot, reached under it for the small metal box. Her father's service photograph. A challenge coin from her first deployment. The USB drive from Thorne's envelope. She placed Harrington's letter inside alongside those things and closed the lid and put the box back. She did not respond. Not then. But the act of placing it there was its own kind of answer, the answer of someone who has received something genuine and chosen to treat it accordingly. The months that followed belonged to the work. The Advanced Warfare program ran the way programs built for people who have already proven themselves tend to run on the assumption that you are ready, and the only question is, how far ready goes? 6 women in the first cohort. Long days and early starts, and the specific exhaustion of being pushed against the outer edge of what you know and finding repeatedly that the edge is farther than you thought. Maya ran the perimeter road most mornings before the first session. She carried her father's voice in her left ear on some of those runs, carried silence on others. Both were useful. Both were part of the same ongoing conversation. She did not think of herself as a symbol. She thought of herself as someone with work to do, and she did it. The Military Leadership Conference convened in Virginia on a Thursday in late September, 11 months after Fort Caldwell. 600 officers and instructors. A wide conference room with high ceilings and the institutional lighting of places that take themselves seriously. Maya stood at the front and spoke for 22 minutes, controlled force application, psychological composure under sustained pressure, the difference between performing readiness and actually having it. Her remarks were precise and practical and entirely free of anything self-congratulatory. She spoke about her father's training. She spoke about what it means to fight clean. She was 3 minutes from finishing when the rear doors opened. She kept speaking. She watched him come through with the same attention she gave everything that entered a space measured immediate factual. He moved differently than he had moved at Fort Caldwell. The limp was slight but permanent, present in every step. The way certain things become permanent, not diminishing, simply there, a piece of the person now. He wore his uniform. His posture was straight. He walked the center aisle toward the front of the room, and the 600 people who had been watching Maya began to understand what was happening, and the room went very quiet. He stopped 6 feet from her. She finished her remarks, set down the cards she had not been reading from anyway, let the silence hold because it deserved the space. Then Harrington turned to the room. His voice was level. He had no notes, and nothing in his delivery was designed for effect. My name is Sergeant Cole Harrington. Colonel James Reeves trained me at the beginning of my career. He was the best teacher I ever had. I didn't honor what he gave me. One beat. He called me 2 months before he died. I didn't pick up. He turned back to Maya. He extended his hand. 600 people held the same breath. Maya looked at his hand, looked at his face, read what was there with the same accurate attention she had always given to things that mattered, not with suspicion, not with charity, but the direct reading of someone trained to see what is actually present rather than what they expect to find. What she found was genuine, stripped of performance, the face of a man who has stopped negotiating with himself about who he is and has arrived at significant personal cost at something true. She took his hand. The applause that followed was not the applause of a crowd that has been entertained. It was older than entertainment. The sound of people witnessing something that doesn't happen often and does not come cheaply, real change, visible and earned, standing in a room with its hands out. When the sound settled, she was still holding his hand. She said it quietly, only for him. He called me too. Harrington went still. The night before the accident, I was in post-deployment processing, barely functional. His name came up and I told myself I'd call him back in the morning. She looked at him without looking away. I didn't pick up either. Something moved across his face that had no precise name. The expression of a person discovering that the weight they have been carrying alone was never carried alone. He had spent 11 months believing he was singular in his failure. That specific certainty had been its own punishment, private, total, isolated. The certainty of a man who looks at that name on a phone screen and makes the wrong choice, and believes afterward that he is the only one who has ever stood in that particular dark. He was not the only one. They stood there, two people who had not answered the phone when James Reeves called, who had been living with that silence in separate rooms for 2 years now, standing in the same room with it for the first time. The handshake ended. Harrington nodded once. Maya nodded back. He turned and walked with his permanent limp back down the aisle toward the rear of the room. The crowd parted for him, the way crowds part for people who have made themselves genuinely smaller, not in defeat, but in the specific and difficult honesty that burns everything performative away and leaves only what is real. Afterward, in the corridor outside the main room, Maya stood with Voss while 600 people dispersed around them in every direction. The comfortable silence of two people who have been through something together and do not need to annotate it. "How do you feel?" Voss asked. Maya thought about it the way she thought about everything that deserved a real answer. "Like something finished," she said. "Not ended. Finished. There's a difference." Voss nodded. She understood the difference. Maya looked down the corridor at all of it, continuing conversations, starting groups, forming the ordinary human movement of a large gathering, returning to its own rhythms, indifferent to this particular moment, and exactly right for being so. "He would have hated the media coverage," she said. A small, real smile moved across her face, private not offered for the room. He was genuinely uncomfortable with public attention. He would have been mortified by the whole thing. The smile stayed for a moment. But he would have understood the handshake. He would have said that was the only point that mattered. She paused. He used to say the measure of a fighter isn't what they do when they win. It's what they do with the silence after. She picked up her bag. "I think I finally understand what he meant." The next morning, 6 o'clock. The training field behind the Virginia facility, gray and cool in the first week of October, the air carrying the particular clarity of a season beginning to turn. Maya was already there. No cameras, no bracket sheet, no crowd standing 4 and 5 deep behind a rope perimeter, no one watching from 30 feet back with a decision to make. Just a field in the early morning light arriving slowly over the tree line to the east, and a woman who had been doing this work since she was 10 years old and intended to keep doing it. She moved through her warm-up the way her father had taught her, not as preparation for something else, but as a thing complete in itself. Each movement given the full attention it deserved. The same attention she had given every opponent at Fort Caldwell, the same attention she gave everything that mattered. Then she began to work. The strikes were clean and unhurried. The footwork was precise. The holds she moved through had been drilled 10,000 times and would be drilled 10,000 more. And each repetition was not repetition. It was the ongoing act of building something that accumulated into capability that became in time not skill, but character. The difference her father had named. The thing that remains when everything else strips away. The sun came up over the tree line. Maya worked in the morning light, and the field held her the way all fields hold what they witness, without judgment, without memory, with the steady patience of ground that has seen 1,000 mornings and will see 1,000 more. Her father's voice was there, not telling her anything. Just present the way it was always present now in the early hours, in the difficult moments, in the work that continues after everything else has settled into the past where it belongs. The way people who have really loved you are always present. Not in grief, not in loss, in the specific and ongoing fact of what they built in you, which moves when you move, which is there, when you are there, which belongs to you in the only way that anything real ever belongs to anyone. She worked. The field was empty. She was exactly where she was supposed to be.